You, a worthless black pig, are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for drug trafficking. The judge's voice thundered through the courtroom, dripping with venom and absolute contempt. His gavel slammed down with a force meant to crush, echoing off the marble walls as a cold silence fell over the room. The young black girl, barely 17, stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. Her heart pounded fiercely against her ribs, each beat a painful reminder of the injustice crushing her. She was innocent. No drugs, no proof, only lies and prejudice wrapped in the judge's hateful words. Murmurs rippled through the crowded courtroom. Some gasped. Others whispered urgently, shocked by the judge's cruelty. But the judge didn't care. His face was twisted with disdain as he glared at her like she was some filthy animal unworthy of dignity. The girl's hands trembled at her sides. Her throat was dry. The entire ordeal felt surreal, like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Just hours ago, she was walking home from school, unaware that her life was about to be ripped apart by baseless accusations. The prosecution had barely presented anything. No witnesses, no evidence. Just a hastily constructed narrative blaming her for drug sales in a neighborhood plagued with poverty and prejudice. But the judge didn't want facts. He wanted a scapegoat, and she fit his cruel agenda perfectly. Order! Order! The bailiff barked, trying to restore some sense of decorum, but the damage was done. The girl's eyes flicked toward the defense attorney, a weary man who glanced back helplessly. There had been no fair chance, no true hearing, only the judge's biased sentence that condemned her. She swallowed hard, fighting tears that threatened to spill. Her mind raced. What would her mother say? Would anyone believe her? Could she survive the nightmare ahead? Her dignity was stripped away publicly, humiliating her in front of everyone. Friends, strangers, the media. But it was the judge's final, poisonous words that cut deepest. Don't expect anyone to save your worthless self. The system isn't built for people like you. Those words weren't just a verdict. They were a declaration of hate, a poisonous weapon wielded by a man drunk on his own power. Outside the courtroom doors, cameras flashed and reporters whispered feverishly, sensing the controversy but missing the ugly truth of racial bias embedded in the justice they were witnessing. The girl's shoulders shook as she fought to stay composed. Her mind flashed to her father, a man she rarely saw but whose name carried weight, a high-ranking government official known for his uncompromising stance on justice. But now, at this moment, he was nowhere to be seen. Her defense attorney approached quietly, murmuring, "We'll appeal this. There's more to this than meets the eye." But the girl barely heard him. She was trapped in a cage of fear and shame, powerless before the judge's harsh ruling. Suddenly, a murmur rose from the back of the courtroom. The heavy wooden door creaked, opening slowly. Every eye turned. A tall figure appeared, flanked by 2 stern men in suits. The courtroom air shifted instantly. Tension crackled like electricity. The judge's smug expression faltered for the first time. The girl's breath caught. She recognized the man, her father. Whispers swelled. "Is that?" The judge's eyes widened as he recognized the visitor. His confidence wavered. For the first time, the scales of power were about to tip. The courtroom held its breath. The judge's words, hateful and cruel, hung in the air. But now, a storm was coming. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted instantly. The air thickened with tension as the judge's gaze locked on the man who had just entered, tall, imposing, and radiating authority. The girl's father, a high-ranking government official whose reputation preceded him, stood firm by the door, flanked by 2 serious-looking men in dark suits. Federal agents. A hushed murmur rippled through the spectators. Cameras snapped wildly. Reporters leaned forward, sensing the storm that was about to break. The judge, who moments ago had delivered his hateful sentence with cruel satisfaction, suddenly looked small, his arrogance faltering, his confident sneer replaced by a flicker of fear. "Your Honor." The man's voice cut through the courtroom like steel, calm, controlled, but with an undeniable edge of power. "I am here to ensure justice is served, not just in word, but in truth." The judge shifted uneasily in his seat. "This court will maintain order. Who are you to interrupt?" he demanded, though the certainty in his voice had wavered. The father's eyes did not leave the judge. "I am her father, and I am accompanied by federal agents to investigate the gross miscarriage of justice that has just occurred." Gasps echoed around the room. The judge's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of his bench. The girl, still frozen moments before, now felt a surge of hope flicker inside her chest. Her father had arrived, a man who could change everything. One of the agents stepped forward, placing a folder thick with papers on the judge's desk. "Your Honor, these documents outline multiple violations: abuse of judicial power, racial discrimination, and false accusation without evidence." The judge's eyes darted over the pages, his expression darkening. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of papers and the weight of unfolding consequences. "Order!" the judge barked, but his voice lacked conviction. Her father's voice rose, steady but commanding. "This girl has been unjustly accused. There is no proof linking her to any illegal activity. This court has allowed racial prejudice to dictate its decisions, and that is unacceptable." The courtroom audience shifted, a mixture of disbelief and growing support for the girl. One federal agent stepped forward and presented a sealed court order from higher authorities authorizing the immediate suspension of the judge pending investigation. The judge's face went pale. The man who once commanded this room with arrogance was now visibly shaken. I demand a recess," he stammered, voice cracking. But the agents were already moving toward him. The girl's father fixed the judge with a cold, unwavering stare. "You will answer for your actions, sir. There will be consequences." The bailiff stood ready as the agents approached the judge. The judge looked around the courtroom, desperate for support, but found none. The spectators, once silent, now watched with stunned fascination. Tears welled in the girl's eyes as she watched the man who had insulted her so deeply, who had tried to destroy her future, being led away in handcuffs. Her father turned to her, his face softened with pride and reassurance. "You are not alone," he said firmly. "No one has the right to treat you this way." The courtroom's mood had transformed completely. The story was no longer about the girl's alleged guilt. It was about justice and the power of truth overcoming hate. The girl felt a wave of relief and strength surge through her. The fight wasn't over, but now, she knew she had an ally more powerful than any judge. As the judge was escorted out, the courtroom buzzed with whispered questions. What would happen next? Would the girl finally be freed? What price would the corrupt judge pay? Her father addressed the courtroom one last time before leaving with the agents. "Let this be a warning. No one is above the law, especially those who abuse their power." The girl's eyes locked with her father's, her heart swelling with hope and gratitude. The nightmare was not over yet, but the tides had turned. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but the father only said one thing: justice will be served. And with that, the girl's long battle for truth was just beginning. The courtroom remained electric with tension long after the judge was escorted out, his usual command replaced by silence and disbelief. But the real drama was only beginning. The girl's father stood tall at the front, his presence commanding respect. He opened the thick folder brought by the federal agents and began to lay out the evidence, or rather the glaring lack thereof, that had condemned his daughter. "There is no credible evidence linking my daughter to any drug activity," he stated firmly, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The arrest was based solely on racial profiling, assumptions, and the reckless prejudices of this so-called judge. Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement spreading through the crowd. The judge had abused his position, wielded it like a weapon against an innocent girl. But now that weapon was being turned back against him. One of the federal agents stepped forward with a stack of documents and video footage from the arrest, clearly showing the girl's innocence and the absence of any drugs or illegal transactions. "This evidence," the father continued, "proves the miscarriage of justice and the systemic racial bias that needs urgent correction." The judge, now removed from the courtroom but still under federal jurisdiction, was swiftly facing investigations for corruption, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. The courtroom had become a stage for a reckoning long overdue. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened again. The judge was brought in, not as the authoritative figure he once was, but handcuffed, his face pale and eyes darting nervously. The crowd gasped. The man who had once sneered at the girl, calling her a black pig, now looked small and broken. The girl's father didn't flinch. He stared directly at the disgraced judge and spoke with quiet authority. "You will answer for your actions, not only in this courtroom but in the eyes of the law." The judge's arrogance had evaporated. For the first time, he appeared vulnerable, even teary-eyed. He was confronted with the reality that his days of unchecked power were over. The federal agents read the charges aloud: abuse of judicial power, racial discrimination, and causing emotional distress to the girl and her family. A hush fell as the judge was led away to await trial. The courtroom was no longer a place of judgment against the girl, but a symbol of justice reclaiming its integrity. The girl, tears still glistening, looked to her father. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "This is just the beginning. We will make sure this never happens again." The judge's downfall sent shockwaves beyond the courtroom. News outlets nationwide picked up the story, exposing a corrupt system that had targeted an innocent girl based on race. But the father wasn't finished. He announced plans to file a civil lawsuit against the judge for a fine of $1 million, a punishment to serve as a warning to others who would abuse their power. The courtroom buzzed with approval and hope. The girl's story transformed from one of victimization to empowerment. Her father's intervention was more than a rescue. It was a powerful statement against injustice and racism. As the courtroom emptied, whispers filled the air. Could this be the moment when change begins? When those in power are held accountable, no matter who they are. The girl stood tall beside her father, finally free from the weight of false accusations. She felt a strength she never knew she had, fueled by the love and power of her family. Her father's calm fury had brought the corrupt judge to tears and to justice. Outside the courthouse, the girl was greeted by supporters, reporters eager to hear her story, and a community ready to rally behind her. For the first time since this nightmare began, she saw a future where truth and fairness might prevail. And deep down, she knew this victory was just the start of a greater fight, one that would demand courage, resilience, and hope. But for now, justice had been served. The courtroom, once filled with tension and fear, now buzzed with a different energy, one of relief, hope, and hard-won justice. The girl stood beside her father, her shoulders steadied by the unwavering strength he radiated. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the crushing weight of false accusation lift from her chest. The judge who had sentenced her so cruelly was no longer a symbol of power but of downfall. The courtroom whispers had turned from shock to admiration for the girl's courage and her father's relentless pursuit of truth. Today marks not just the end of a personal battle, but a victory against systemic injustice. Her father declared as reporters crowded around. His voice was calm but resolute. No one should ever be judged by the color of their skin or condemned without evidence. We demand accountability. Her defense attorney, now brimming with renewed confidence, stepped forward. The charges against this young woman have been officially dropped. The court acknowledges the lack of evidence and the unacceptable conduct of the previous judge. The girl's eyes welled with tears, tears of relief, vindication, and the release of months of fear and humiliation. The crowd around her applauded softly, some wiping their own eyes. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, community leaders, activists, and neighbors who had followed her story with growing outrage and compassion. They lifted signs demanding justice and equality, their voices echoing a collective call for change. The father embraced his daughter tightly. "You showed strength that no one expected. You stood tall even when the world tried to break you." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want people to know the truth. I want others who face injustice to know they're not alone." News outlets were already running stories framing the judge's disgrace as a watershed moment. Headlines proclaimed, "Justice triumphs over prejudice," and "Powerful official steps in to protect innocent teen." The girl's story resonated nationwide, sparking conversations about race, power, and fairness in the judicial system. But the father knew the fight was far from over. "We will be filing a civil lawsuit against the judge for a $1 million fine," he said. "This is not about money. It's about setting a precedent. No one, regardless of their position, is above the law." The courtroom drama became a catalyst for broader investigations into other cases where bias may have corrupted justice. The girl's ordeal sparked renewed calls for judicial reform and accountability. In quiet moments after the press frenzy died down, the girl reflected on her journey. The fear, the humiliation, and the near hopelessness had transformed into resilience and purpose. She had faced the worst of the system and survived. Her father remained by her side, a guardian not only in law but in spirit. "Your story will inspire others," he promised. "We will make sure your voice is heard." As the sun set outside the courthouse, the girl looked forward, no longer as a victim, but as a survivor and a symbol of hope. The scars of the past would remain, but they would no longer define her. Instead, her courage and her father's power had carved a path toward justice. Together, they had shown the world that even in the darkest moments, truth and dignity could prevail. And that was a message no judge, no matter how powerful, could ever silence. The weeks following the courtroom showdown felt like a whirlwind, one that would change the lives of everyone involved forever. The disgraced judge, once a towering figure in the local judiciary, now faced an unprecedented fall from grace. Federal investigators had uncovered a troubling pattern of racial bias and abuse of power in his previous rulings. The evidence was overwhelming. In a packed courtroom, the judge stood trial, not as the authority he once was, but as a defendant fighting to save whatever dignity remained. The prosecution laid out a relentless case, detailing the hateful insults hurled at the girl, the baseless accusations, and the deliberate attempts to silence her. Witnesses testified about his harsh treatment of minority defendants and his blatant disregard for the principles of justice. Throughout the trial, the judge's face grew paler, his usual arrogance replaced by desperation. He attempted to deny the charges, but the weight of truth was too heavy to escape. The girl and her father watched quietly from the courtroom gallery, their eyes fixed on the man who had tried to destroy her life. But now the scales of justice were balancing. When the final verdict was read, silence fell like a heavy curtain. On charges of racial discrimination, abuse of judicial power, and emotional harm to the accused, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. The judge presiding over the trial declared solemnly. The courtroom erupted in whispered astonishment. The man who had once insulted and condemned an innocent girl was now being condemned himself. The sentence was severe: immediate removal from the bench, a $1 million fine, and criminal penalties including jail time. Tears of relief and triumph welled in the girl's eyes as she heard the judge's ultimate defeat. Her father's hand squeezed hers firmly, pride shining in his gaze. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed to capture the moment. The story of injustice reversed was no longer just a local scandal. It was a powerful symbol of accountability. The judge, led away in handcuffs, avoided looking at the girl or her father. The power that once fueled his cruelty had evaporated, replaced by shame. The girl stepped forward to address the crowd, her voice steady and clear. "Today is more than a victory for me. It's a victory for everyone who has been wronged by a system that sometimes forgets justice." Her father stood beside her, adding, "This case sends a message loud and clear. No one is above the law. We will continue fighting until justice is fair for all." The community rallied around them, inspired by the strength and courage that had turned a nightmare into hope. The girl's life was no longer defined by the cruel words and false accusations. Instead, she became a beacon of resilience and truth. And the judge, the man who called her a black pig and tried to crush her future, was left to face the consequences of his actions. His defeat was not just personal but symbolic. a reminder that hatred and abuse of power cannot stand forever. As the sun set on this chapter of their lives, the girl and her father walked forward together, united and unbroken. Justice had not only been served, it had prevailed.